The most dangerous part of the journey to the moon did not happen on the moon. It happened when Artemis II saw Earth again. At about 400,000 feet in altitude, the spacecraft crossed the edge of the atmosphere at more than 34,800 feet per second. Just 24 seconds later, Mission Control's voice disappeared. 6 minutes of silence. 6 minutes, in which the plasma wrapped around the capsule and turned it into an isolated, burning object, falling at a speed approaching 40,000 kilometers per hour. And that is the first contradiction. Earth, home, was the most violent wall of the entire journey. Not the lunar darkness, not the vacuum, not the distance, the atmosphere. Because returning from low orbit is one thing, returning from the moon is another category of reality. In Earth orbit, a spacecraft falls. From the moon, a spacecraft returns carrying the energy of an interplanetary trajectory. And that energy is not negotiable. It is dissipated in the form of friction, compression, temperature, and deceleration. Orion's heat shield had to withstand around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, almost half the temperature of the surface of the Sunday. The question is not only how it does not get destroyed, the question is why Orion does not come straight in, why it first touches the atmosphere and then goes back out again, like a stone bouncing over black water. And the answer to that completely changes what it means to come home from the moon. The first time human beings experienced anything like this was on Apollo the 8th of December 1968. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first to circle the moon and look at Earth from that impossible edge. They did not find a heroic landscape. They found an absence. Borman described the moon as a vast, lonely, hostile expanse. Lovell, by contrast, looked back and said something that still pierces time. The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space. And then came the moment that redefined our species. Anders saw the planet rise above the lunar horizon and exclaimed, "Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" They went to the moon and discovered Earth. But Apollo 8 returned with a different philosophy. The Apollo capsules performed a direct entry. They crossed the atmosphere and followed a less flexible trajectory, with a maximum post-entry range of about 1,725 miles. That made it necessary to deploy U.S. Navy ships across remote areas of the Pacific, as if returning from the moon was still a 19th century naval expedition. Orion was designed for another era. Its goal was not simply to survive, it was to return with precision, closer to the coast, with rapid recovery, with less physical violence for the crew, and less operational randomness. The difference seems technical. It is not. Between falling and bouncing, there is a new idea of exploration, moving from the unrepeatable feat to infrastructure, and that is exactly what Artemis II is trying to prove. The maneuver is called skip entry, entry with a bounce. It sounds elegant. In reality, it is brutally precise. Orion does not plunge into the atmosphere all at once. It first enters the upper layers, uses the natural lift of its capsule, exits again for a moment toward a region with much less drag, and then re-enters for the final descent under parachutes. It is, literally, the motion of a stone thrown at the exact angle over a lake. Except that here, the stone carries 4 human beings coming from the moon. The benefit is immense. Orion can travel up to 5,524 miles beyond the entry point, much farther than Apollo, and that makes it possible to aim much more accurately for the splashdown site off the coast of California. And that precision is not a luxury, it is physiology, it is survival. NASA explains that the bounce divides the deceleration into 2 lower intensity events, around 4 Gs, instead of 1 more aggressive blow. It also distributes the thermal load into 2 phases. Less punishment for the vehicle, less punishment for the bodies, less time until recovering a crew that has just endured the most violent segment of the journey. Put another way, this maneuver does not exist to impress engineers. It exists so that, when the spacecraft touches the ocean, the astronauts are still in condition to speak, to breathe with control, to exit safely, to return transformed into witnesses and not barely functional survivors. But what a crew experiences between the onset of plasma and the opening of the parachutes cannot be understood from an animation. It is understood through the body. That is where Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen stop being names on a patch and become human again. Wiseman said that the moon is an anchor, a calendar, a spiritual symbol, something that connects all of Earth's civilization. Glover spoke about the concept of duty, not as personal glory, but as a response to a need. Koch repeats an idea that, on a flight like this, stops sounding inspirational and becomes surgical. Do what scares you. Hansen summarized it in an even bolder way, showing up every day for something greater than oneself. Because once re-entry begins, the public symbolism no longer matters. What matters is the inside of the cabin. What matters is the pressure of the harness. What matters is breathing turning into mechanical work. At 3.9 G, the body weighs nearly 4 times more. The chest pushes downward. The arms no longer feel normal. Every checklist demands discipline when the body wants something else: to stay still and endure. And then comes the cruelest detail. The silence does not mean failure. It means that everything is happening as it was supposed to happen. The plasma around the spacecraft blocks communication. Houston cannot speak. The crew cannot explain what they feel. During those minutes, humanity does not accompany its astronauts. It only waits for them. And yet, perhaps that is the deepest reason why this mission matters. Christina Koch told a story about her father and her grandmother looking at the moon when he was young. The grandmother told him, "Don't worry, Ronnie, we'll never get there." 70 years later, that boy's daughter was traveling around the moon. Koch said that, for her, that means possibility. That is the psychological heart of Artemis II. Not to prove that a few people can endure a fierce re-entry, but to prove that the impossible ages, that the unthinkable becomes routine, and that the price of that transformation is always paid first in the body and mind of a specific crew. And then comes the moment the entire journey had been building toward: entry interface. 400,000 feet. 34,882 feet per second. Just 24 seconds later, the vehicle enters blackout. The maximum reported speed during that descent is around 24,661 miles per hour, approximately Mach 33. Outside, the heat shield turns the return into a controlled storm of compression, plasma, and light. Inside, time deforms. The seconds seem denser than the entire trip between Earth and the Moon. This is the promise that held up the opening hook, understanding why the last segment of the journey is also the most intimate. Because here one no longer explores, here one endures. Here one trusts in calculations made years earlier by people who will never sit in that seat. Then, almost all at once, hell begins to organize itself. First, the forward bay cover is released. Then the drogue parachutes come out. Then the pilots. Finally, 3 main parachutes, about 116 feet in diameter, take the mass of the capsule and force it to accept another physics, that of slow descent. The speed drops from hundreds of kilometers per hour to less than 20 miles per hour. The vehicle that was coming from the moon stops being a projectile and becomes a vessel again. And that change is more than mechanical. It is narrative. It is emotional. Earth stops being a wall and becomes a destination again. At 22,000 feet, the drogues deploy. Near 6,000 feet, the mains come in. NASA's planned splashdown for Artemis II takes place off the coast of San Diego at a speed close to 19 or 20 miles per hour. It sounds gentle. It is not. It is a hard blow against the ocean after 10 days, hundreds of thousands of miles, and a thermal sequence that few vehicles in history have endured. But here is the revelation that makes everything before it worth it. A lunar mission is not won by seeing the moon. It is won by returning with enough control that the next journey stops seeming insane. Artemis II did not just test a capsule. It tested a promise that distance can become a system. That is why Artemis II's re-entry matters more than it seems. It is not the epilogue of the journey. It is the final exam of the entire lunar architecture. If you cannot bring your crew back from the moon with precision, speed, and a reasonable physiological margin, then you do not have a sustained program. You have a series of spectacular gestures. Orion was conceived for something different. so that returning from the moon would not depend on the randomness of an immense ocean, but on a technology capable of repeating, refining, and turning the feat into a route. And that word route changes history. Because when a path stops being exceptional, civilization moves along it. But if you want to understand what comes next, the question is no longer how to survive the return. The question is how to descend, work, and lift off again from a region where the light arrives at a low angle, the terrain is treacherous, and the ice may decide the future of all human exploration. That is where the next threshold truly begins. Artemis III will not have returning home as its climax. Its climax will be landing where we have never landed and turning the lunar South Pole into the first operational edge of another civilization. And when that happens, Artemis II's re-entry will be seen for what it really was. The exact moment when we stopped visiting the moon in our imagination and began learning how to truly go and come back.